G'day everyone, you are watching the latest video on the channel. If you read my community post last week, you would know why I haven't been uploading much recently. In this video, I will be going through my round 6 AFL tips. Thankfully, over the last 2 weeks, I had somewhat big rounds. Last round was gather round, speaking of which. I really don't think they should always do it in Adelaide. I heard that gather round would always be held in Adelaide. Let's have a brief look on how I went in tipping for gather round. I got 6 out of 9 correct last week, so that brings up my season total to 23 out of 45 tips. I tipped Adelaide to beat Carlton and got that one correct, but I didn't expect such a thrashing. I tipped Richmond to lose to Sydney. At one point in the last quarter, Richmond were a good chance to win, but then Sydney made them look like they gave up. I tipped Brisbane to beat North Melbourne very convincingly. Maybe North Melbourne were pretenders in the first 2 rounds, or maybe Freo and West Coast were low quality teams. I tipped Geelong to beat West Coast. They looked on track to win by 100 in the third quarter, but didn't even end up winning by 50. I tipped GWS to beat Hawthorn. I didn't think it was going to be close, as Hawthorn put up a fight. I tipped Collingwood to beat St Kilda. I was considering tipping the Saints, as that was a 50-50 game. For my incorrect tips, I tipped Fremantle to lose to Gold Coast. I originally tipped Freo to win, but I just felt like Frederick was such a big out. Well, actually he was playing, I thought he wasn't. Maybe I was reading an outdated injury list. It appeared as such in the second and third quarters, but then they ran over the top of the Suns in the last quarter. I tipped Port Adelaide to lose to the Bulldogs, another tip that I changed because of the wet weather. I thought the Bulldogs usually played well in the wet. And like 95% of people, I tipped Essendon to lose to Melbourne. Pretty much like most people who would get this tip correct would be Essendon fans. So that is a brief look at how my round 5 tips went. To kick off round 6, we have the Dockers hosting the Dogs at Optus Stadium on Thursday night. I know Freo beat the Suns last week and the umpires made some bad calls in favour of the Suns, but this game is somewhat of a test for the Dockers. This is one game we need to win in order to prove ourselves. The Bulldogs aren't as bad as people think, like they always struggle to play at Adelaide Oval. The Bulldogs have been playing well at Optus. Like last year, Freo were one of the best teams in the competition. If they weren't, the Bulldogs would have won. Switkowski is a big out for the Dockers, and I feel like the Dockers are sometimes better without Taberner, even though Taberner is injured. He's not very consistent. The Bulldogs are also under some injury struggles, with Josh Bruce suffering broken ribs, Bailey Smith out with a calf injury, and Alex Keith out with concussion. Waitman was outstanding in his return game, kicking 4 goals. Both these two teams have good defence but poor forward lines. It all depends on which team's up for the challenge up front. However, the Bulldogs definitely shape up as the better team when you look at the wins both teams recorded. The Bulldogs to salute in a scrappy affair by 27 points, and for a big call, the Dockers to have 2 whole quarters in a row without scoring a goal. Saturday couldn't possibly have started with a more unexciting matchup than West Coast taking on Port Adelaide at Adelaide Oval. The Power have been very impressive the last 2 weeks, upsetting the Swans at the SCG and knocking off the Bulldogs in the rain. Sitting 9th, they hope to catapult themselves into the top 8. All they need to do is take down an injury-savage West Coast outfit on their home deck. West Coast will get Shannon Hearn and Luke Shuey back, but Elliot Yeo has suffered a serious groin injury in which he would need a month to recover from. If Port Adelaide lose this game, it would be safe to say that you can never predict when they are going to win or lose. I'm not going to lie, they kind of do have high highs and low lows. As we saw, they smashed Brisbane to open up their season and then copped horrendous losses against Collingwood and Adelaide in the next 2 weeks by 71 and 31 respectively. Those 2 ins for West Coast could spark some confidence in them, but Port Adelaide are right in front of an open door to the top 8, and this shapes up as an easy win for them. Port Adelaide to make the most of their opportunities for a percentage grab in a 72-point victory, and for a big call they'll register a quarter time score of at least 50. Next we have a kind of interesting matchup between the Giants and the Lions at Manuka Oval. A bit of confidence sparked in the Lions after an impressive annihilation of North Melbourne, and they look to bring that skill and talent they showed in that game to Canberra to face a similarly performing Giants side. The Giants were only able to beat the wooden spoon favourites by 2 points. It should have shaped up as a comfortable win, but they only won by 2 points at the expense of inaccuracy. Don't get me wrong, a trip to Canberra to face GWS is not quite easy. Last year they gave Fremantle a pretty big scare in the last round of the 2022 season. I know they lost to Brisbane there by 40 points last year, but GWS is arguably better this year than they were last year. They're definitely a sneaky chance to pull off an upset. They've been competitive in all of their games this season, except maybe the West Coast game. They are inconsistent too, so anything could happen in this game. I just think the way Brisbane are going this year, they'll be too strong for many teams. It takes a while for good teams to get going, and GWS don't really have what it takes to beat a team in such form as the Lions. Brisbane to get a scare from the Giants and survive, hanging on by 8 points at the final siren. And my big call is that both teams will register a halftime score of at least 60. This next matchup is big. Sydney taking on Geelong at GMHBA Stadium. Will Sydney be able to get their grand final revenge? Well, GMHBA have always been a fortress for Geelong, and very rarely do teams win there. Out of all the teams other than Geelong, Sydney probably have the best record at the category. It all depends on who's more hungry for the win. Geelong need this win to prove that they are truly a top tier team, and Sydney want revenge on that horrific grand final loss. Sydney just need to overcome their mental insecurities caused by that grand final, and they'll definitely be in it. Geelong recently haven't been putting up a four-quarter effort despite recording big wins against Hawthorn and West Coast by 82 and 47 respectively. I just feel like Geelong's home ground advantage is too strong and always has been. Geelong to get the chocolates by 12 points. And for a big call, this is pretty big when you look at what we've seen from Geelong. Jeremy Cameron to kick 1 goal or less. Moving on to Sunday footy, we have Hawthorn hosting the Adelaide Crows in Tasmania. Adelaide starting to develop a powerhouse forward line with the likes of Rankin and Rochelle. Hawthorn were impressive against GWS, but I felt like they were lucky to lose by only 2 points when you look at it. GWS had 7 more scoring shots. Hawthorn will remain without Mitch Lewis and Will Day, so it will be harder to effectively manage down back. Don't forget, Adelaide's not only good in their forward line, Jordan Dawson and Rory Lett have been on fire when it came to clearances. To be honest, Adelaide usually struggles against Hawthorn in Tasmania, but this Adelaide team we're seeing now is completely different to the Adelaide team of the last 3 years. I think Hawthorn will put up a fight, but in the end Adelaide will be too strong. I don't have the bravery to actually tip Hawthorn in a game like this, but I have confidence in them. Adelaide to get the job done in a high-scoring affair by 22 points, and for a big call, Adelaide's biggest lead will be more than 50 points. I'm expecting more of a fight from Hawthorn late in the game. Next, we have another big clash between Carlton and St Kilda at Marvel Stadium. Both these two teams are hard to beat at Marvel Stadium, and both teams were handed their first loss this year. I think St Kilda shapes up as the better team. Look at both teams' percentages. Carlton isn't even above 100, and St Kilda's like over 140. Carlton haven't been winning their games convincingly, and I guess they got a reality check against Adelaide, but Carlton have always produced poor footy at Adelaide Oval. A lot of hope will spark in the Saints as Jack Steele and Tim Membry both make their return. Carlton are suffering from the absence of key players such as Sard. However, it may be a challenge for the St Kilda's defence to handle a forward line made up of more taller people. I thought Carlton was a good team, now they're probably not as good as I think they are. St Kilda to get the job done comfortably by 23 points, and for a big call, both teams will register an aggregate score of 50 points or less at half time. Perhaps the one game of this round that nobody will watch on their TV, Gold Coast taking on North Melbourne at Heritage Bank Stadium. I don't know what's happening to North Melbourne, they just collapsed after a great win against the Dockers at Optus Stadium in round 2. Maybe Freo isn't a good team like I said, or maybe North Melbourne were lucky in that game. Gold Coast should win this game because it's at home, but they aren't really trustworthy at the moment. Consider these two games here that they've played this season. Many of us expected them to beat Sydney, but they lost. Many of us expected them to lose to Geelong, but they won. Sydney's a good team, but don't they usually struggle against the Suns? When you look at the stats for both North and Gold Coast around the field, you'll find they're quite even. North Melbourne is not a bad team, but they can't produce their best footy for more than 2 quarters. And losing Jai Simpkin will really hurt, especially since Gold Coast have some big ins such as Casbolt and Witts. Gold Coast to win in a close to comfortable win by 13 points, and Mabior Chol to kick 5 or more goals. And now the classic Anzac Eve clash between Melbourne and Richmond at the MCG. Ever since Richmond lost Tom Lynch, they've been far from their best, having lost to the Swans by 44 points last week and the Bulldogs in the wet the week before. Richmond need a win to keep their season alive, but I wouldn't say it's over if they lose to Melbourne because their fixture is quite soft from here on. Richmond will get Jaden Short back, so that will spark some hope, but Melbourne will get Gawn, Lever and Dunstan back. Those outs played a key part in the Essendon loss last week. Also, both of Melbourne's losses were not at the MCG. But where Richmond's goals will be coming from is a question when you match up their broken forward line against a duo of Lever and May. They need to rely on some of their younger forwards such as like Samson, Ryan. I'm not even sure if Liam Baker's injured or not. They need to rely on the younger forwards as Jack Rea or Dustin Martin are both getting old and burnt out. Yes, Richmond has pulled off the extraordinary quite a few times, but I have a feeling they'll have one more bad game before they get better. Melbourne to be back at their best in this game, getting the job done by a hefty 66-point margin. And my big call is that Melbourne will lead by 50 or more points at half-time. You could not end this round any better. Second versus third. 2 bitter rivals named Collingwood and Essendon at the MCG, aka the home of footy, on April 25th, the day known as Anzac Day, where there will be an expected crowd of over 90,000. Both teams were on fire last week, picking up wins against St Kilda and Melbourne respectively. Notice how St Kilda were keeping up with Collingwood for most of the game. That was definitely a game Collingwood had to play their best footy to win. Essendon, on the other hand, produced something very similar against Melbourne, but by an even bigger margin. Essendon's win means only twice have Melbourne conceded 100 points since 2019. It shows that Essendon had a lot of depth up forward. So far, Collingwood have been the more trustworthy side, but over the last few years, Essendon has been unpredictable. In my opinion, they are the one team you can't discount. They always pull off at least one upset. Both teams hate each other so much that they will be taking up to each other, and it's a game that depends on who's more hungry for the win. I'm actually going to tip the Bombers in this game. This will be a good game, but I'm tipping Essendon in a tight contest by 7 points, and my big call is that both teams will enjoy a 24-point lead anytime in the game. If the results go as predicted, the latter should end up pretty similar to last week's. The Saints and Bombers holding their positions in the top 2, a 5-way tie between Melbourne, Adelaide, Collingwood, Port Adelaide and Brisbane, Carlton slipping down to 8th, the Bulldogs equal with Geelong and Sydney only to be dominated by percentage, a 4-way tie between GWS, Freo, North Melbourne and Gold Coast, Richmond yet to win their second game, and West Coast and Hawthorn remaining as the bottom 2. The margin comp for this round is Collingwood versus Essendon. Please enter your tips in the comments. Entries close at 3:20 p.m. on Tuesday. You can change your tips if you want, but you must do it all before that 3:20 deadline on Tuesday. As always, the person who is closest to the margin will get a shout out next week. Thanks for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe and comment if you want more AFL content on the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.